So let's get into the class itself. I like to give a brief introduction, especially for those who are new to the space. So my name is Jocelyn Ramirez. I'm the chef and founder of Todo Verde. I was going to say here in Los Angeles, I'm not in LA right now, but I'm the chef and founder of Todo Verde in Los Angeles, really focusing on plant-based Mexican cuisine, plant-based Mexican food, because growing up, that's what I ate. That's my culture. That's what is like kind of like flowing through me. And when I decided to go plant-based, for me personally, it was a mixture of health, environmental, like social justice related issues or reasons. A lot of people thought, well, what are you going to eat? You essentially are not going to eat any of the Mexican food that we grew up eating. So that really became my journey to start to recreate some of these more traditional, quote unquote, traditional recipes, and remaking them into plant-based versions, which in the process have learned a lot about the fact that our actual traditional food is actually mostly plant-based. Our ancestral foods are mostly plant-based. And over time, post-colonization, we have evolved to believe that our traditions involve meat, dairy, all the things, especially in Mexican culture, which is not true. So here to kind of debunk some of that, to really explore what some of these flavors could feel like or taste like without any of the animal products involved. So thank you so much for joining in this class. We're going to get started with our Tamal de Elote recipe, just again, because I want to try to get those in the steamer ASAP, so that if we get towards the end of class and I can pull one out and show you what it looks like, even 75, 80% of the way there cooked through, I can kind of give you some guidance on what things to look for, especially if you're new to making tamales. So I want to get through that recipe first. Then once we get those tamales in the steamer, we'll start working on our esquite recipe and then our cashew crema. So if you are cooking along, make sure you have most of your ingredients measured out, if not all. It just makes life easier. I know it's gonna make your kitchen a little bit messier and that you're using all these bowls and containers and things like that, but will just flow so much easier through the class. And I also am soaking some cashews for our cashew cream, which I'll talk about later. But if you're not soaking them, make sure you put those in some, if you're going to be cooking along, make sure they're in some hot water right now. Just pour some hot water, warm water over them, even if it's hot tap water. And that's going to help them rehydrate a whole lot faster. And then last night, I started soaking my corn husks. Now, if you don't have, the whole night to soak your corn husks, you can absolutely, again, use hot water, and that's going to speed up the process to get them nice and rehydrated. So we just want to get them so that they're nice, pliable. We can use them fairly easily in this recipe. And I just soaked them because it was overnight in just regular room temp water. I think it might have been just like barely warm, like lukewarm water. I'm going to give these a rinse. You can drain them, and sometimes they're preserved in things that it smells a little bit acidic. So you want to just give them a really good rinse just to make sure you get the majority of that out of there. And then these will be ready to go. I'm going to set these aside. I'll get to these a little bit later, but I just wanted to show you what that looks like. And then you'll see that I have a bowl on top, just a heavy bowl that's also filled with water. And that's just to help the leaves submerge into the liquid. Otherwise, they're just going to float around on the top. Now, the main part of our recipe today is obviously, of all our recipes, is corn. So we're working a lot of corn right now. And masa harina is definitely the star ingredient here for our tamal de elote. And I have 3 cups here of our masa harina. And really important is when you're measuring out your masa harina, I think we have a tendency to like grab our measuring cup and like bring it into the bag and kind of like try to scoop out as much of that masa harina as we can. And what you do is you end up compacting a bunch of masa harina into the cup measurement. So instead, what you should do is place your cup measurement into your bowl and grab your bag and gently pour into the cup, and you'll get a nice, fluffy, airy 1 cup, a true cup measurement for your masa harina. So I have my 3 cups here, and then I'm just gonna end up using 2 cups of fresh corn kernels. I just cut the kernels off the cob, and this is about 2 cups. Now you can leave them chunky like this if you want. However, I'm going to, if I had my food processor here, I would use my food processor to just gently break them down. I didn't bring my food processor with me, so I'm just going to use my Vitamix, which I did bring with me, which is kind of like my travel buddy these days. Well, not that I'm traveling a bunch, but it's I'm definitely going to be bringing my Vitamix with me everywhere. So I'm just going to throw these into my Vitamix, and I'm just going to blitz them until they get just minced up, broken down. Of course, you could do that with a knife too if you didn't have a high power blender or you didn't have a food processor. You could definitely just use your knife to help break these down. I'm just going to pan up slightly, bring these corn kernels in here.
Sorry, Jocelyn, can I quickly ask, good morning.
Good morning, Tara. Tara, right? Oh yeah, there you are.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I am just wondering about how many ears of corn you needed to get that many kernels.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it kind of varies, to be honest with you, depending on the size. But I used about like 2 slightly larger than medium. I wouldn't say they were large ears of corn. And they each yielded about 1 cup each. So, so that's kind of like a general rule of thumb. I say general because obviously if you have really small ears of corn, you're going to yield a little bit less than that. But yeah, it was about 2 ears of corn, or it was 2 ears of corn for me.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so I brought it over to my Vitamix. I'm going to just turn it on and just break these down. So the consistency that I'm looking for is still chunky. I still see texture there, but you can see that it's nice and creamy and it's kind of moving around and slushing around in there. That's what I'm looking for. I still want to get kind of like that creamed corn consistency. It doesn't need to be super liquefied. Let me grab my spatula here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this into the bowl with my mozzarella here. So I'm just going to use my spatula. Actually, before I do that, unless you already did it, but before I do that, I'm actually going to whisk in the dry ingredients first. I have a cup of sugar. I have a tablespoon of baking powder. I'm using a raw, really crystallized, flaky turbinado sugar. The tablespoon of the baking powder is what's going to help my tamales rise. Now, if you didn't do this, I know I'm kind of like going a little bit fast, but if you didn't do that, it's totally fine. I just want to do that real quick. Look at this tiny little whisk, so cute. Oh my goodness. So I'm just gonna whisk that in just so it's nice and well incorporated. And then I'll create a little well. So this is kind of typical of baking, right? Is like you mix in your dry ingredients and then you add in the wet ingredients. So I'll create a little well there at the center. And then let me go ahead and start with these wet ingredients here. I have my nice kind of chunky, creamy corn kernels, kind of milky texture. And that's going to provide a little bit of that moisture that we need for this dish. And then I have on my stove, which I'll bring over in a second, is the other elements, which are my hot water, which I have on a hot water kettle that's been warming up this whole time. So it should be to temperature, and I'm just going to pour out. I'm going to start off with 1.5 cups, and then I'm going to add my 1/2 cup additional to get to the 2 cups if needed. And I also have some coconut oil, which is a refined coconut oil. Very important here. I know I mentioned it there in the notes, but refined coconut oil is essential for most of the recipes that I make that require that type of fat. Essentially, it's kind of replacing the lard in the recipe, and the refined doesn't have a coconut flavor. So if you're using a regular coconut oil, it's going to taste like coconut, and it's going to kind of take away some of the notes that you're bringing in with the corn flavors. All right, so let me go ahead and turn off my hot water kettle. Hopefully these little bowls are not too hot. So I have my coconut oil, which I'll show in a second, that I melted down, and I also melted down some butter. I just had it just right next to the hot water kettle. And I just realized that I didn't turn on my second camera, Sarah. Oh my God. I'll turn it on right now just so you can see the stove when we get to it in a second. All right. Okay, so before I pour in my hot water, I want to just pour in my coconut oil. Now this is a little trick, especially if your coconut oil is still kind of thick. Like mine was thick and creamy, but now it's like really, really liquidy and clear. It's just completely melted down to almost you know, like a very loose oil. And before I got to this point, it was a very thick, almost like that kind of like lard consistency when it's a little bit colder. It hasn't come to a full heated temperature. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour that in. But what I was saying is if yours is still very like thick and creamy, it hasn't melted down this much, the trick is to put the coconut oil and the butter in first and then pour that hot water over the top so that it helps to kind of melt it down. So that was, I put in a half a cup of coconut oil. I think I'm gonna be fine with half a cup. If you like yours a little bit more of that like fatty note in yours, you can add an additional quarter cup. So it's anywhere between half a cup to 3/4 cups. And then I have 4 tablespoons of butter that I also melted down. Now the butter here, I like because as you can see, even melted down, it has a sort of like creamy, thicker texture. And typically that's because lots of the vegan butters out there in the market also have cashews in them. So it provides a little bit of that kind of creaminess to it. And also it has that sort of buttery flavor. So it's gone through a little bit of that fermentation process. It has live cultures in it. And so I want to add it here because it's adding a little bit of that flavor profile that feels a little bit different than just the refined coconut oil. So far I have my mozzarella, my coconut oil, my butter, my sugar, my baking powder. Now all I'm missing at this point is just my hot water. So I'm going to do 1.5 cups to begin. I have a 1 cup measure here. I'm going to eyeball the half cup. So first I'll do the 1 cup. And I'll pour that over. And then let me get that half cup. So I'm gonna eyeball about half cup here. Get that poured in and put this back on the stove. And let me mix this all together. I'm gonna start with my little tiny whisk that I have here, and then I'm gonna bring in my spatula actually to help me fold it all together a little bit more easily. So just work all of the ingredients together. Make sure you're scraping the sides. It's gonna feel really loose at first. And that's really because the mozzarella is just starting to become activated with that hot liquid. And so once it starts to absorb some of that hot liquid, it'll thicken up even more for you. So let me start getting I need to give it one more mix before I bring in my spatula actually. Make sure I get, if you see any little areas that have dry pockets, like dry mozzarella that has not been worked into the liquid, make sure that that gets worked in right away so you don't have any clumping. And of course, if you have a hand mixer, you can absolutely use a hand mixer to help you mix this all together. It's not going to be smooth because obviously you have all that kind of chunky corn consistency in there, but you'll be able to kind of see whether they're little bits of corn or whether they're clumps of the dry mozzarella. And so you can see this nice consistency here. I can tell from this that I have a good amount of fat in it just because it's kind of like smooth kind of texture to it. That is partially because of the fat in there that helps to smooth it out rather than it being all just water. You can give it a taste to see if you think it has enough of the sugar in there. If it has enough of everything that you're kind of looking for, and what the final cooked product is gonna taste like, that is really nice and delicious. If you find that yours gets a little bit too thick and it's not really feeling like this consistency here, then you can add the other remaining half cup of water to loosen it up. You can also add the remaining quarter cup of coconut oil if you'd like to loosen it up with a little bit more fat. So it's really up to you on what you would prefer. Now, some recipes for tamales de elote don't even have very much hot water. They actually mostly rely on fat. Like they mostly rely on oil or lard or something like that, which is so interesting because it's just a lot of fat and corn mixed together. Whereas I didn't want to do all of that. I did want to just incorporate some of the water and let the corn shine and not have to have so much fat in it. So let me bring that up close. You can see it has a nice little shine to it, which is coming from the coconut oil and the butter in there. If you like to salt your sweets like I do, I'm actually going to add a tiny pinch of sea salt, which I have here. So up to you if you like to salt any of your sweets, just a pinch is totally fine. And then I'm going to start putting in my masa harina into my corn husks. So any questions as you're working this together for anybody who's cooking along? I'm gonna do one thing, I'm gonna turn on the stove camera, but feel free to ask any questions that have come up so far. I can still hear.
I do have one more question that's kind of backtracking a
Yeah,
bit,
no,
but
of course.
I bought tamale husks yesterday, and I've purchased them a couple times now, and the pack that I bought yesterday was like a little bit damp inside, and they've usually been dry, but then you were saying that sometimes the tamale husks seem acidic, so I thought hopefully that's okay, but I just hadn't experienced that before, and they did have a strong smell, so I want to make sure they don't like flavor my tamales.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So that is exactly what I was talking about, is that it's essentially like a preservative in there. And, you know, sometimes I feel like, I don't know this for sure, but sometimes I wonder if because the production is like so heavy at the end of each year because of the holiday season, that when we buy them in the early part of the year of the following year, if these are just like corn husks that have been in the store since December, you know, and so they're kind of like a little bit old. So I wonder if that could be the reason why, like sometimes when I pick them up around this time of the year as well, they do feel like slightly damp, but they're not spoiled. But they like, it's almost like the preservatives like really trying to like be like, hang on, don't go bad, you know? So just make sure that you give them a really good rinse. Like I'm going to drain mine out and then I'm gonna give them a rinse a couple times just to get rid of any of that, you know, obviously the flavor in the water that may have come from any of that, you know, acid that's preserving them, and just try to get any of that flavor out. I also like to, like, as I'm washing them, I like give them a squeeze a little bit to try to like squeeze out anything that's in them. So it's like, imagine like you're washing like a towel, right? And you kind of like squeezing the towel and getting all that stuff out of there. So I'm just, I know my thing's just like off camera there, but just give him a squeeze with this filled with water, and that will help too. All right. So I am going to give these one last squeeze. So I'm just going to like literally lift them up and just squeeze out a bunch of that liquid there, you know? Let me bring this a little closer. So I'm just trying to squeeze out as much of that liquid. And then let me pan down here and show you how I like to assemble my tamales. So I feel like not all corn husks are created equal. Actually, I'm going to use a cutting board and put this offside. So, you know, some of them have certain qualities that I'm looking for that I like to use for tamales. Let me actually grab a towel here. so I can slightly pat them down. Grab this towel. So for example, like this tamal husk for me is perfect. So what I look for are ones that have, obviously they're all gonna have these like nice ridges going down. It's the seam of the tamal husk, but you can see that it's a nice wide tamal husk, and it also doesn't have any additional textures. It looks smooth except for, you know, the lines, the ridges going down. To show a contrasting tamal husk, let me find one that has these, sometimes they have these like little ripples in them, which yesterday as I was kind of picking them out, I didn't pick that many that had the ripples in them. This one kind of does. I can show you here. So sometimes they have like additional little like waves and ripples. Like this one barely has some, where you can see here, there's like kind of like indentations going this way, you know? Sometimes there's some that have like very clear indentations. They're very prominent going down the corn husk that are cross grain, like they're not together with the grain. This one is another good example. And so the reason these aren't my particular favorite ones is just because whatever the corn husk shape is like is whatever your tamal is going to end up looking like. So it essentially takes on the shape of the husk. So if they have all these additional kind of imperfections, those are typically the ones that I like to use to tear if I'm going to create little ties for my tamales. Now, I'm actually going to use this one to tear because it's already pretty much torn in half. So essentially, anytime you're trying to tear to create your little ties, you just want to just rip them down the seam. It's super easy. You can just create little ties. If they're short, you can always even tie them to each other. It's like shoestrings. You can tie them to each other, make a little knot. You can make it tight, but you got to be gentle because it will tear like that one just did. I just tore the end off, but this is now double the length, right? So you can definitely do this. And for sweet tamales, sometimes I do tie those. I am going to tie the ones that I'm making now. And my reasoning for it is because I'm not going to fill up the whole pot right now. I'm only going to add maybe like 3 or 4 tamales in the pot. And so if I don't tie them, because they're not getting all sandwiched together, they're not all right next to each other, what happens is because of the steam and how hot it is, the tamales and the masa will kind of like ooze down slightly, and it'll create very imperfect tamales, ones that are very heavy on the bottom, or, you know, or just kind of little balls at the bottom versus more of like a tamal shape. So when you add the ties to them, it helps to kind of keep them together so that they can stay in the shape that you want them to be. So usually at home, I do have a 2-ounce scooper. It looks like an ice cream scoop. In fact, there is an ice cream scoop here that I can use, but I'm not sure if it's exactly 2 ounces. And so what that does is just helps to create some consistency in the sizes of your tamales. This is a ice cream scoop. I don't know exactly how much it'll yield, but if I use it, and I kind of know like, oh, I'm scooping out this much each time, then my tamales essentially come out pretty similar in size every time. So I would put that, I'm actually going to add a tiny bit more. Anywhere between like 2 to 3 ounces is typically where I like to go with the sweet tamales. And these are so much easier than savory tamales because they're not going to get filled with anything unless you want to fill them with something. But all you need to do is just kind of create your, let me actually push this a little bit closer to the center because I am going to tie both ends. And you just fold over one side, and I try to like kind of squish it in there and make it nice and tight. And then I'm going to fold over the other side, rolling pretty tightly. Wherever your seam ends up, that is the back of your tamal. And so then you want to fold the bottom, which is as you can see, this is the more narrow end of your tamal husk. You want to fold that up towards the back or up towards that seam opening. And then this is where your ties come into place. So you can tie a knot here with your corn string. You can make a little bow. You can, you know, some people get really intricate with this. It's really up to you on how much time you have. And then on the bottom, I'm going to add another tie. And I may need to, let's see here. I actually do need to piece another one together. So if I was making a full pot of tamales right now, which I will after class, but I don't want to just have the whole rest of the class be you watching me stuff tamales. I want to get into the other stuff. So if I were to be stuffing the whole pot with tamales, I'd likely end up with at least a dozen of these little tamales. And I might not tie all of them because there'd be so many in there all close up to each other that I would, they'll be able to stand up without falling and oozing towards the bottom. So tamales cook with the opening, which is in this case here, face up, right? And as the heat source gets really hot, they start to kind of ooze down, but this is gonna really help kind of hold it together. So let me do a couple more and get them into the pot. So here's a really nice, beautiful one again, nice and wide. I put the masa harina, the prepared masa harina, kind of towards the center, but a little closer to the wider end of my tamal. So if, you know, if you would just were to say that it's a triangular shape, a little bit closer to the base of the triangle. Another really important thing, if you're not super familiar with making tamales, is you want to go with the shape of the corn husk. So if you look at it, it's rounded where, you know, where the corn was living inside of this corn husk, and that is where you want to place the masa. You don't want to, you know, flip the leaf over and try to get it to round on the opposite side. So you want to go with the natural shape of the corn husk. So again, I'm going to grab about 2 to 3 ounces or so of my masa harina. I don't have to spread it out at all because it's not getting filled. So I have it here towards the center, a little bit closer to the base of my triangle. I am going to fold over one side, and then I'm going to kind of press and fold, and wherever my seam ends up, that's the back or the opening of my tamal. I'm going to use my fingers to just slightly pinch up at the bottom of the tamal where the more narrow end is, and I'm going to fold that up towards the same side that has the opening. So all the openings are towards one direction. And then let me go ahead. So, you know, you can see that this will hold really nicely, especially if you had a bunch of them all lined up. One other thing you can do is, I can see here that there's kind of a point of masa here, so that it's pointed right here, and then it kind of is less filled on the sides. So if you want, you can, you know, stick your fingers in there or use your hands to kind of pinch and get it to all be uniform. So it's very moldable. You can make sure that it has the look and feel that you like. Let me grab a couple of these, or create a couple of these little ties. Tie these together. Hopefully don't rip them. This one's like super fragile. Ooh. These are like little works of art. It's like a little art project. And so, you know, growing up in a Mexican household, people have different tasks for the big tamaladas. You know, when you're a kid, like this is what you're doing, like, oh, tear all these and tie them together, you know, or, you know, use a cloth to kind of pat down all the tamal husks, or you can scoop in this amount of masa into the corn husk. But then, you know, the older, and maybe not even older, like it could even be like once you're a teenager, now you're the one who's like spreading the masa out for the savory tamales. Now you're the one who is, you know, filling the tamales or rolling them. So you kind of like upgrade over time what your responsibilities are in the tamaladas. Okay. So let me get one more. I'm happy to answer any questions if you are making them now and you have any questions, or even if you're not making them and you're just watching and have some questions that you know might come up for you later. Here's another nice wide one with a nice smooth ridges there. Gonna just give it a little pat down. I'm not trying to dry it off. I just don't want it to have big droplets of water there. Let me add another scoop. That's way too little. And you can make these as big as you want to. So if you know, oh, it's just gonna be for me and my partner or whatever, you can make them a little bigger.
Jocelyn, could you tell us a few common mistakes that maybe you've seen people make while they're making tamales?
Oh, that's a great question. I think a few common mistakes might be, I feel like it's easy to make mistakes, but it's also very easy to correct them. And if your masa is good, it's still gonna taste really good. I think the main thing is maybe not giving as much care and attention to the ingredients. Like, it's a long process. And so I think sometimes people try to take some shortcuts just because it's a tedious process. And I think that that's a common mistake. This is something that is to be enjoyed. It's a process that is going to take time. You're committed to it in the kitchen. And if you don't end up tasting every element of it, and then you go through the whole process of cooking them up, it's just not going to be worth all the time that you invested into it. So make sure every step of the way you're tasting. If you're making savory tamales, like, taste the fillings, taste the actual masa harina itself. Another common misconception is that you can use like cornmeal for your tamales, and that is not true. You should be using masa harina. Now, masa harina has gone through this process of nixtamalization, which means that the corn has been rehydrated in a calcium limestone, and that has really allowed the corn, the dry corn, to sort of bloom in that calcium limestone and to release that like outer skin or outer layer of the corn. And so what that does is it creates another kind of flavor component, and it's what's traditionally used in a recipe like tamales. And so please don't use cornmeal. I've heard people say like, oh, I made tortillas out of cornmeal, but they're like super dry and like grainy. I'm like, yeah, dude, like, you're not supposed to use that for this recipe. So I think that's another common mistake. So I have these 3 little babies right here, my little tamalitos. I'm gonna head over to the stove and show you how I place them into my steamer pot, which has been turned on prior to class. So let me head over there and show you. It's gonna be nice and hot, ready for us to start working these. Ooh, and let me actually add a little bit more water to this too. So what you should be able to see here is that I have this steamer basket on the bottom of my pot. And I just want to make sure that I have enough water in here that is almost all the way up to the edge or the surface of my steamer basket. Yeah, that looks about right. So you want to make sure, really important, that your tamales are steaming and that there's constantly water in your pot. And it shouldn't come over the line of your steamer basket. You don't want to introduce water into your tamales. And also very important, the openings that I mentioned, the area where you could see the masa, needs to be facing up. So you never want to, face down or anything like that, because the heat is going to have it melt down slightly and it's just going to be a big old mess. The other thing I like to do is, obviously we had the side of the tamal that has all the folds, right? That has all the seams. That is important for it to be, the seam should be facing the side of the pot. So if I didn't have these all tied up, if I were to put the seam side facing the center of the pot, it would start to open up, and then eventually with the heat, the masa is just going to ooze out of the tamal. So you want to make sure that you put the seam facing the side of the pot, and then you want to go all around the pot, adding all of your tamales around the outer edge. So you create an outer circle, an inner circle, maybe you can add another 1 or 2. And then at that point, I start to stack some laying down on top if I've maxed out my capacity inside of the pot. And so you just want to let them hang out in here. You want to set the lid on. I like using a glass lid pot, because a pot with a glass lid, I should say, because I can see the steam happening in here. So shortly after this being closed for a bit, I'll be able to see all the water droplets in here, lots of steam, lots of moisture. These need to steam. The moment that I start to see it look like this, you know, right now I don't see the steam because I didn't have it on and I just put it on. But if it's been sitting in here for a while and it looks dry like this, then I know that there's likely no more water inside. And what you need to do when you add water is I like to just grab my tongs and kind of like move the tamales around to create a little bit of space for me to just gently pour water directly to the bottom of the pot and make sure that I don't get any water inside of my tamales. So if you add a few drops of water and you hear that sizzle, it probably means that you are running extremely low on water at the bottom of your pot. And you urgently need to add more, because then what will happen is you'll end up scalding your tamales and you're going to get this very like smoky, burnt flavor introduced into your tamales, which you don't want. So these need to cook for at least 45 to an hour. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to show you somewhat what these should look like once we get closer to the end of class. So we're at 11. Ooh, maybe not, maybe, but we're going to try to make it work here. I'm actually going to move this pot to a back burner out of the way as we start to get our other recipes working here. So let me turn this on. If I'm still getting used to the stove here, which is a very odd stove. There we go. Oh, so close, dude. The whole rest of the class is just going to be you watching me trying to turn on the stove. There we go. Oh. All right, there we go. Whew, finally. All right, so let me go ahead and move this back to that back burner out of the way. I'm going to keep my front burner on here and I'm going to turn on my other burners. All right, let me get this other one turned on. All right, there we go. And I want to get my heat source onto like a medium low heat. And so as that's getting worked, let me just come to the front camera here for a second. So I have 6 ears of corn that I've already cleaned up. I try to remove as much of the corn silk as possible, obviously remove the husks. I have this mostly white corn, and then I have this one that's a yellow color that's so beautiful. And so all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fire roast them. If you don't have a gas stove range, you could put them in the oven if you wanted to, or you could turn on, like if you have a cast iron grill that you can put on your stove and let that come to temperature, you can grill them inside. So whatever works best for you, or if you have a grill outside, you can also grill these. And I just like to get that sort of char, slight blackening to happen to the corn. I feel like it adds additional flavor. Some esquite recipes boil the corn. And if that's your jam, if you love boiled corn, you can absolutely do that. I personally don't prefer just boiling corn and having, you know, it feels a little bit more wet to me, that esquite. So I prefer to fire roast. So all I'm gonna do is I am going to come back to the stove. I have my corn here and I'm going to just figure out how to place these in a way that they don't like fall directly into the stove. Maybe I could do this. I'm gonna try to focus here actually on the big burner. And I'm just gonna use my burners here to fire roast these ears of corn. I have my tamales cooking up this corn. And I just gotta keep an eye on them, keep churning them as I see that they get that nice kind of char going, because obviously the char is gonna be focused on the areas where the flame is directly touching the corn. Here we go, I'm gonna turn that up ever so slightly. And I wanna get a nice char on them, but I don't wanna do it like immediately, because then I'm gonna end up just kind of not cooking them through all the way. I'm gonna turn on that back burner a little higher because it's such a little tiny flame.
And what would you suggest for folks who are using a stove that doesn't have an open flame, that's an electric?
Great, so what I was just mentioning is you could definitely, if your oven has a broiler function, you can pop them in the oven and use that broiler function. If you have, I know at home, I have a cast iron comal that is as big as 2 burners, and it has the sort of the grill shape. You know, it has those ridges in it. So when it comes to temperature, it gets really hot, it'll create those kind of grill marks that you see when you grill corn outdoors. So you can do something like that as well. And obviously if you have an outdoor grill that's easy to use, you know, then you can use that as well. So you can see that nice charring that I got so far on that ear of corn. And I just want to keep moving it around, making sure that I'm kind of evenly trying to cook it as much as possible. All right. So I'm going to just keep an eye on these, keep these working. This is going to take about 10 minutes or so since I have all of them on at the same time. If you don't have all 3 burners available to you, or if you haven't started cooking your tamales yet and you want to use all 4, it'll be a little bit faster. You can spread them out a little bit easier. I'm using 6 ears of corn. I know the recipe called for 6 to 7. I'm using 6 because, as you can see, these are fairly large. So I thought 7 would be a little much. And also it's just my partner and I, so it's kind of overkill. Like we're gonna eat so much corn the next couple days, you know? All right. And the other thing I mentioned for that person who doesn't have a gas range stove is, again, if you like the flavor of your corn boiled, you can absolutely boil this as well too. I've actually seen other chefs who make esquite as a part of their menu also cut the kernels of the corn off of the raw corn ears, and then they saute the corn with a little bit of oil in a pan or on a plancha. So their process is a little bit different. They don't do whole ears of corn this way, but I like to do it this way because I like to use flame. So even with polvo verde in the kitchen, we would use a char broiler, turn up the heat, crank it up all the way, and then put the whole ears of corn on the flame burners, and that would provide that nice kind of char effect that I like in corn generally. Anytime corn is savory, I prefer this method. When you keep moving this around,
Sorry, can I backtrack with a quick question?
Of course.
My masa is a little bit, it looks a little wetter than yours did, and I'm just wondering if I should just let it sit, or if that's okay that it's a little bit more wet, or if I should add some masa to it.
Can I see it? Ooh, yeah, it is a little bit more wet. I see what you're saying. And you just did the same amounts of the liquids that I did, right?
Yeah, I went more on the side of 3 cups of corn. And to blend it, and I used a NutriBullet. I did put a little bit of water to blend it, but I put less hot water, so I thought that would be fine. But
yeah, so what you could do is add a little bit more of the masarina. I would maybe do about like half cup,
okay,
quarter cup to half cup of masarina, and see if that kind of helps to absorb some of that excess. Okay. And also, like, don't be afraid of it being too wet either, because once it steams off and it cooks through, you're gonna have like a really nice moist tamal. It's gonna be probably more moist than mine, so it's not gonna create a terrible tamal recipe. It'll still be good. All right, so I'm heading back to my corn over here. Ooh, Ooh, this one's getting super charred up. So this one's almost done actually. I just need to make sure that I'm getting other areas, not just the center. Turn this one over. And I just hope I don't set the fire alarm off in here. Just because there is no hood over the stove at this house. So hopefully it doesn't get all crazy in here. And the other thing with this recipe is if you find that you have, like, for example, this you know, ear of corn is like mostly cooked through. There's a couple little bits that could use a little bit more cooking time. But you feel like I can see the difference, like even looking at, I don't know if on your end, let me pull up closer to the camera. But like if I look at this side of the corn here, I can see that the color is more golden and cooked through, but just over here, it still looks a little undercooked. And so, you know, that's what I am kind of looking out for. But if I find that it gets a little bit closer to the color profile that I'm looking for and that like it's mostly cooked through, I will go ahead and pull it out. And as I pile the corn into a bowl or container, it still continues to cook for a little while just because of that residual heat coming off the heat source. It's still pretty hot. So this one I'll just give another minute or so and then I'll remove from the heat. Make sure I'm getting this end. Is anybody else charring up their corn right now? Or is everybody? Oh yeah, I see Robert in the background charring corn. Yeah. Awesome. It's always great when you have two people in the kitchen. All right. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove this ear of corn that looks nice and charred through. Let me grab my bowl, throw it in there. Let me get this one cooking just at the top here. I'm gonna move, let's see, which one is cooking less? This one back here. Bring this one to this hot burner. Almost there, folks. And what's cool about this recipe is like, once you get the corn charred, the rest is, I mean, not that this is difficult. This is actually pretty simple, right? Like just charring corn over an open flame, keeping an eye on it. But this is kind of like the heart of the recipe. And, you know, once we get this done, we just need to cut the corn off the cob. Once it's, you're able to touch it, once it cools down slightly, mix in the chile, the mayo, the oil, give it that kind of like fatty texture and make the cream. But the cream you're gonna find, especially for folks out there who haven't made this cream yet, it's so easy. It is so, so easy. You're gonna be shocked at how simple it is, how quick it is to make. And you're gonna have such an easy time making this esquite later too.
And Jocelyn, is that cracking we're hearing, the sound of corn popping?
It is, yeah. So yeah, it's definitely corn popping, all the sound effects. Yeah, the corn's like, ah, you have me on this heat source, it's so hot. It's like crackling, popping. So that's just what it is whenever you grill corn on an open heat source like this. I mean, even if you were cooking it on a, in a pan, you'd still have a little bit of popping, not as much because obviously that corn has been cut off the cob. And so the liquid is just gonna ooze out rather than like pop. So, you know, you'll have a little bit different sound effects if you cut it off the cob first. But yes, that is the corn speaking to me. I'm trying to think if there were any other kind of common mistakes with tamales that I see. I'm like, I feel like there are, and I just can't think of any. You know, I've seen people try to, like, they forget to soak the corn husks, and they're like, can I just use it like this? They're kind of soft and pliable. Soaking is pretty essential, just because, again, you want to try to remove any of that excess flavoring, like Tara and I were mentioning, that might be you know, any extra ingredients that might be on that corn husk. You want to give them a good soak and rinse. And then also, even if they are a little bit pliable, they're never going to be as pliable as a corn husk that has been soaked. At least if you're soaking with hot water, give them a good 30 minutes or more in that hot water. And of course, if you're soaking overnight, that's always the ideal situation.
What about using fresh corn husks? Is that a thing? Can you do that?
Yeah, you can do that. To be honest with you, my family, I don't really ever see my family use fresh corn husks. I've seen them use fresh corn husks, and that like they grow corn in the rancho that my family has in Mexico, but they still dry that corn husk. So it's always still on a dry corn husk. I've never seen it with a fresh, like I just cut this corn fresh and I'm going to make tamales with the corn husk. It's typically still dry. However, I don't see why that couldn't work. The only reason I can think about that might be kind of tricky is that a fresh corn husk, it holds its shape a whole lot better than the rehydrated, kind of soaked, dried version. So you might have a harder time folding those up because the shape of it, it's because it's so fresh, it's just going to want to like stay in the shape that it has. So you're likely, even if you're making savory tamales, you're probably going to have to use ties to get those to kind of hold the shape that you want them to hold.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Let me turn off that back little flame. All right, turn this one.
Is it a thing to overcook tamales, or just wondering if you leave them on too long, if they really dry out, or it's okay to kind of leave them in the steamer like after they're done, like after an hour for a while?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it is definitely okay to leave them in the steamer past the hour. In fact, most tamalerias, like places in, you know, Los Angeles, for example, like East LA that sell lots of tamales, they have the tamales in the pot like for hours on end, waiting for you to come in and buy them and eat them, and they need to be at temperature. So yes, they can definitely stay in the pot for long periods of time. Sometimes that's why you see them wrapped even more so. So not only will they be wrapped in a corn husk, but then they might also be wrapped in like a piece of parchment paper or something like that, or wax paper, to kind of make sure that they stay together and that all that excess kind of steaming liquid doesn't really penetrate and make them soggy tamales. So you can leave them in there longer. And the thing that I like to do when I cook tamales, for savories, for bigger tamales that have like a filling and all that, I typically like to cook them for like at least an hour. And then I turn off the heat and I just let them hang out in there with the lid on for, you know, it could be anywhere up to like, I've done it for like 30 minutes, 45 minutes. I open it up and they're still piping hot because there are so many in there, and they're so tightly packed that they still stay really, really hot. But I also find that helps them set a little bit, because when you are steaming tamales and they're just cooked and you take them out, they're very soft, and you can break them easily. Like if you're just trying to like open them up out of the corn husk and like drop them on a plate, like they can break pretty easily. They're pretty fragile. But if you let them kind of set for a little bit of time, you know, same thing for like what people say for like cakes or tarts or cookies or whatever, is like give them that little bit of time to set so that you'll yield an even better textured tamal. It's holds up a little bit better. That's what I like to do.
You just mentioned there a little bit about the difference when you're cooking between sweet and savory tamales, but are there any other key differences other than the fillings and how you prepare them?
Oh, that's a great question. I just had like a piece of corn pop at my face. I was like, ah, dodging corn kernels over here. I mean, I think that the major differences for me are obviously like the savory tamales. You need to make sure that you spread, like your masa consistency has to be pretty good and spreadable so that you can fill the tamal and essentially like cover the filling completely. so that when you open up that tamal, you can't even see what's inside. Typically, sometimes you can see, like if you have a queso con rajas, you can see like a little bit of that chile coming through. But typically you want to try to like have that all completely covered with masa. And then for those, my family doesn't typically tie any of the savory tamales just because, I don't know, it's just not our thing. We just do the fold the same way that I showed you without any of the ties. And that's typically the way that we work our tamales. In terms of cook times, it's probably around the same amount of time or so. In fact, I would say that the sweet tamales, because they are masa all the way through, probably sometimes we'll need a little bit extra time. Like maybe Tara, yours that have a little bit excess liquid might need a little bit extra time to cook through and kind of firm up a little bit. And that is because for savory tamales, the filling is typically already cooked. So you're only really trying to cook the masa during that time. And the masa is a thin layer that surrounds the filling, whereas the sweet tamales are just like a chunk of just raw masa. And you need to make sure that the steam penetrates all the way through to the center. So you have a cooked masa all the way through to the center. So, you know, that's one thing that you'll want to check. One thing that you'll also look out for, which we'll do towards the end of class when we're looking at these tamales in here, which you can see are like steaming like crazy right now, which is exactly what I want, is that, you know, when the masa is done, when the tamal itself keeps the shape of the corn husk, so it has that little kind of like the ridges that we were talking about, it has that shape. I can't use my finger to smooth it out or anything because it's already cooked to that shape. So it's not raw masa anymore. And you can also easily remove the hoja. Now that I find is more true, that method of like checking the hoja. In Spanish we say si se despega fácil, like if you can remove the corn husk easily from the masa. Because sometimes when it's, you spread the masa for the savory tamales, and then you try to remove the leaf from that, the corn husk from that, then it's stuck to it. It's stuck to the corn husk. Like you did a good job of like smearing it on the corn husk. So you can't easily just remove the corn husk from that. So, you know, I don't find that method to be as true for the sweet ones because for me, it wasn't about like pressing it onto the corn husk. You know, obviously we just put like a chunk of masa in there and then folded it up. But that's kind of the method that we use for the savory ones. All right, I think I am going to give this one last turn here and then remove it from the heat source.
Sorry, I'm gonna throw in one last question. If that's okay.
Oh yeah, no, feel free to keep asking as many questions as you'd like.
I have the pan for the tamales and I just put the water. So I'm wondering if I should heat up the water before starting to like put the tamales inside, or if I should put the tamales inside and then like put it on medium heat. Like I just don't know if it matters what order to.
Yeah, no, I would say that you can put it in now. It might be easier on your hands to put them in now before the pot gets hot, because obviously the steam burns. So, you know, you can definitely put them in now. Just add that time to your cook time. So don't start your cook time until you actually see them steaming. Once you see the steam happening, then it's like, okay, now I have like about 45 to an hour until they're cooked through. All right. Last two pieces of corn. Let me get this one over here. This heat source has turned out to be the best one, the biggest burner. Okay. Wow, this Airbnb, this person's gonna be like, wow, they trashed my stove while they were here. There's just like little pops of like corn everywhere. I mean, good times. This is like all part of the fun, you know? You gotta make a mess in the kitchen in order to know that you had a good time.
Just leave them some tamales and then they'll be happy.
That's a great idea, actually. I hope so. Back in LA, I tend to give all my neighbors like tons of food. I overfeed them back home because, you know, I'll make a whole batch of tamales and I eat a few. You can freeze them actually, which is what I was going to say towards the end too. but yeah, I might leave them a batch here. But tamales, you can always freeze. They freeze really, really well, which is why you see them at most grocery stores now. They're selling frozen tamales. All you have to do to reheat them is steam them again until they're warmed all the way through. You can also, even the esquite freezes pretty well too. So once it's all cut off the cob, seasoned, oiled, all the things, you can also freeze any excess esquite that you like. It'll also hold in your fridge. Both items will hold in your fridge for at least a good week. And the cashew cream I like to have on hand, and the cashew cream, you can incorporate a bunch of other fun things into it. You can, you know, add some chipotle, blend it in there and make a chipotle crema. You can add fresh herbs and use that. It's sort of like a, you know, like you can almost make like your own ranch dressing, for example. So there's tons of things that you can do with the cashew crema that's very, very versatile. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove these last ears of corn, which probably took longer than the 10 minutes I said they were gonna take, but the other burners just took so long. So I have all my ears of corn here that are nice and charred. As you can see, this is like the nice char that I like to have. I'm gonna just set these aside for now and let them become a little bit cooler before I start cutting the corn off of the cob. Now, in the meantime, let's move on to our cashew crema. All I need to do is rinse the blender that I used to blend up the corn. So let me do that. And then we'll start working that cashew cream. Okay. All right, so my cashews, as I mentioned, have been soaking. I started soaking them about an hour before class. So at this point, they've been soaking for a couple hours in warm liquid. I typically use raw cashew pieces, but for today's class, just because what I had on hand was whole fancy cashew pieces, that's what I'm using. Now, the difference is mostly that the raw cashew pieces are all broken up little pieces, whereas these nice fancy whole cashews are beautiful whole ones. As you can see, like they're round, they're beautiful. Now these are more expensive than the pieces. So that's why I usually recommend raw cashew pieces, because all the cashews that I use end up becoming blended into a sauce, a cream, a cheese. And so it's not really necessary for me to spend the extra dollars to have them look super beautiful if they're just gonna get blended up into a sauce. Now I just soak them enough to make sure that they're submerged in liquid. I'm not gonna use this liquid. I'm going to go ahead and just drain them. I'm gonna just drain that liquid out. And now I have just like beautiful soaked cashews that have been drained for at least a couple hours. If you don't have a high power blender like a Vitamix or so on and so forth, you wanna make sure that you give them a good soak. Sometimes even soaking them overnight in the fridge is the best option, just to make sure they get really nice and soft. So this is 5 ounces of raw cashews. I just used my measuring cup and just looked at what the 5 ounce mark was. I was using like a clear measuring cup where you can see like the 4 and 6 ounce mark clearly. So obviously 5 ounces is just in between those 2 marks. And I'm gonna go ahead and toss in to a blender my 5 ounces of cashews or cashew pieces, whatever you have on hand. Really important here to try to use raw cashews versus toasted cashews, because the raw cashews are going to be less flavorful, because the toasted obviously adds a layer of flavor to it. And with any recipes that I use that include cashews, it's very rare that I want you to be able to taste the fact that there's cashews in there. I'm usually just using them as a creamy texture, or using them for their creamy texture, and not trying to get anybody to realize there's cashews in there. So raw cashews are best to be able to hide that. Now I have a couple other ingredients in here, or over here. Again, super, super easy recipe. I have 5 ounces of raw cashews that have been soaked and drained. I have a half a cup of just like regular water. I'm gonna throw in that half a cup of water. And then I have 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. I'm gonna add about half of it. This is just freshly squeezed lemon juice. I'm gonna add about half of it. So I'll start with 1 tablespoon, and if I feel like it needs more, I'll add the rest of it. And then salt to taste. Make sure that your recipe is nice and salty and tangy. This is supposed to be a crema, so it should pack a nice punch of saltiness. So it should feel, or should taste tangy, sour. It should taste salty. The tanginess is coming from the lemon juice, saltiness obviously from the salt. And we're gonna just blend this until it's super, super smooth and creamy. So I'm just gonna go right behind the counter here and blend. I'm gonna start low, and then I'm gonna go up high, and I'll blend for a little bit so it's gonna get loud. All right, so let's open this up and check out the consistency. So you can see here, I have this really, really smooth kind of stick to the back of a spoon texture. I want to taste for saltiness, for tanginess. Ooh, that is really good. I think I'm good on maybe a touch more salt. I don't think I need any more lemon juice in there. And one thing I will say is it will become slightly thicker typically once it sits for a little bit. So if you were to make this cream today, it'll be slightly thicker tomorrow, but it should still be a nice creamy consistency. Let me just give that a last blend with the additional salt. And you want to look out for any pieces, like you're trying to not get any cashew bits, you know, in there. So you should be able to see that it's really, really nice and smooth and creamy. Perfect. And I have a little squeeze bottle that I'm going to add my cashew cream to. That'll be a nice effect to include in the esquite recipe, just over the top. Let me actually get rid of that.
And Jocelyn, if we are allergic to nuts, can we substitute the cashews for something like pumpkin seed?
Yeah, actually I had emailed somebody about that. So yeah, you can totally use pepitas. You know, very similar process. I've also seen folks make cream out of coconut cream, which I find still tastes like coconut. So I'm not a huge fan of it, but some people swear by it. So if you are a fan of coconut, that is another option. You would have to add a good amount of that, like lemon and salt and stuff like that, to get it to taste nice and acidic, like a cream should. But yeah, you can also soak pepitas. If you toast the pepitas are gonna taste, they're gonna be more prominent. So I would try to keep them raw and see if you can get that nice punch of flavor. So I have my little squeeze bottle of my nice smooth cashew cream. You would have never known that that was cashews just a moment ago. So let's move on back to our esquite, which you're gonna see comes together super, super quickly. I'm going to bring over my other ingredients. Actually, let me set them back here and bring them forward once I cut the corn off the cob, actually. So I'm going to place my corn down here, just off. There we go. I'm gonna grab a little bowl that I was using. So essentially, whenever you're cutting corn, the corn kernels go all over the place, right? So if you put a small bowl inside of a larger bowl, that's supposed to kind of help you catch any of the corn kernels. Now let me grab my knife. You want to just carefully place the corn on top of the smaller bowl that's inverted inside of your larger bowl. Bear claw your fingers away from the blade and just use your knife to just cut down just the kernels. Don't cut too deep. Turn that cob and just keep going around and around and around until you get all those kernels off the cob. It's just as simple as that. It's still going to be a little bit messy, and that corn, it just does that, right? It just kind of pops all over the place, literally, popcorn, but also just raw corn. But this method kind of helps to capture a majority of that. So I have my 6 ears of corn. I'm just going to go down all 6. Again, once it's cool enough to touch. So if you find, oh, I'm burning myself, it's hot, give it another little few minutes to just slightly cool down. And if you're always, if you're hesitant to come up too high because you're afraid to cut your fingers, you know, some of my staff used to use this method of like kind of doing this, and you cut halfway this way, then you turn it, you cut the other half of it going down. I just find like that takes double the time, you know? So I just like to use this method of going all the way down one straight line. Now, my knife is super sharp, and you can see I was like cutting a little too deep into the cob there. And what's gonna happen is if I do that, obviously the cob is like super fibrous and like not the texture we're looking for. We don't wanna eat that. So if you find yourself cutting a little too far, you're gonna have like these really hard bits inside of your esquite, which you don't want. So don't cut too deep into it. And for your actual corn cob, the cob that we're leaving behind, what you could do is, obviously you can compost it if you have a composting system around here. If you're in Los Angeles and you're near an LA compost hub, you can sign up and donate your food scraps to those compost hubs to help create more healthy, delicious soil for LA community members. Or you can also, if you want to reuse them one more time, is you can always create a broth out of them. You can make a really delicious vegetable broth with your corn cobs. Add in a few other ingredients. If you're into like onions, garlic, you can add like the base of your celery. You can add some carrot greens, like all different, whatever things that you typically don't eat that are still flavorful. You can add those to a good generous amount of water, add some salt. I like to add some dry mushrooms, some konbu, and just let that cook down until it reduces by like half, and you're gonna have this like super rich, delicious vegetable broth. All right, almost done. Last cob. You're like, dang, how many more stories does she have about corn, this girl, you know? I've got lots, everybody. Actually, this smell reminds me of like being at my family's rancho in Mexico. Like I mentioned earlier, we used to pick fresh corn and start a fire and then just start roasting corn. So this smell is like super nostalgic for me. All right,
what is
so
your favorite variety of corn to work with and eat?
Yeah, I mean, I really love just like a good old, like I know that there's like a like the different like scientific names. We just kind of know them as like the white, the yellow, the blue, like the, you know, all the different colors of the corn. I really love like a sweet yellow corn. There is, if you're in the Los Angeles area and you go to the South Pasadena Farmers Market, there is one of the farmer booths there that sell this like really delicious, like speckled, like white and yellow fresh corn on the cob. That is so, so sweet and delicious. I can't remember the name of the booth, but they're kind of on that like off little street where the farmer's market ends. I think it's like right next to like maybe like a library or something like that. And it's like just so, so delicious. They're my favorite place to get fresh corn whenever I can make it there. All right, so I just use my hands to just kind of break up the kernels because obviously they got cut off in like little chunks and they tend to just form little, you know, little pieces together. So I'm just trying to break that up. I have that nice, delicious char on them. Let me give my hands a rinse. And then this is very quickly, very easily going to come together with just adding the remainder of my ingredients. I have here my 1/4 cup of, I like to use grapeseed oil. This is my cooking oil that I typically have on hand. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. 1/4 cup of that oil. I have a tablespoon of my chile California, which is a very, very mild chile. It's more of smoky and just has like a chile flavor that's not really capsaicin, so it's not spicy. It's just a flavor of that like dried, delicious chile. And then I also do have a couple tablespoons of just vegan mayo. Let me actually grab a spatula so it's easier for me to scoop this out. So I have this couple tablespoons of vegan mayo. If you are not into mayo or you don't have vegan mayo on hand, you can obviously use some of the cashew cream that we just made. So you can use some of that cream to add that creamy texture. Some people just absolutely love the flavor of mayo, and that's very typical for like Mexican street corn. You'll see the elotero like smear on a very generous amount of mayonnaise, and then they'll add on some cheese and like a bunch of other layers, chile and all that to it. So this is just meant to kind of give folks, especially who have that like nostalgic feel with like their corn, give it that sort of like mayonnaise-y kind of tartness so that it feels like that street corn that we're used to getting. So I'm just working this all in. And one thing I haven't added is just salt. Let me add a good amount of salt here. I have just some sea salt, salt to taste. I'm gonna add a couple pinches here. And then if you wanted to, you could even add a little bit of lemon juice in here. I have a little bit of lemon juice that's left over from earlier. I'm gonna give this a taste first, but obviously you can add a little splash of that and it'll brighten the whole thing up. And that is our esquite. Let me give this a taste for salt. Oh, where are my utensils? Here we go. Okay, and actually, let me remove. There we go. All right, so I'm going to give this a little taste. You can see there that nice charred goodness, nice and creamy, has a little specks of chile. Needs a little bit more salt. I'm gonna mix this all together with that additional salt. Make sure you're scraping the outer edges of your bowl. Get a little bit more of that. I'm like, doesn't need a touch more salt. I love salt. There's also sea salt. It's like very flaky sea salt. So it's not like melting into the whole thing right away. They're like little bits of salt hanging out in there. All right, this should be good to go. So the way you would serve this is you can either do like one large serving bowl and use a cream over the top, or of course, you can serve a little bit of this in smaller cups or bowls. And if people really love mayonnaise. Like, I don't know if you've seen esquite cups in Mexico, but sometimes they'll just like scrape over the top, like another layer of mayonnaise with corn, sorry, not with corn, with cheese, with more chile, with a lime on the side, or squeeze that lemon over the top, lime or lemon. I'm gonna just add a nice drizzle of my cashew cream over the top. So I have that nice sort of like creamy texture over the top. And then give that a taste. So that's gonna give it that nice tanginess coming from that lemon juice in there, that nice creaminess. So, so good. Let's keep that Mexican street corn right here. So, so yummy. Okay. I have so much corn, everybody. So last thing I want to do, I know we're over time here, is I just want to show you what the tamal is looking like so far. I'm crossing my fingers and that it's mostly cooked. I'm going to bring one over to my countertop here, to my cutting board, so we can take a look at it together. Let me grab one out of the pot. Coming over to the stove here, I have a good amount of steam coming out of the pot. And then I'm just going to grab one of these. So as you can see, I think you're looking at my stove right now. I'm not sure if you're looking at the back of me. Okay, so I had a good amount of steam here. I can hear it bubbling at the bottom. Let me actually move it closer to you because I think it's like super far away from you right now. So all that good steam happening. I can turn this burner back on right after we're done. But you can see here that even though these 3 tamales were kind of standing on their own, they stayed in the shape because of the ties. They stayed in the shape that I wanted them to. I'm gonna grab the smallest one, which is this one, hoping that it is cooked all the way through. So let's go back to the counter here. And let's try to open this up. So I am going to just untie the ties or slide them off. And then I'm going to unwrap here. It's very hot. And so I still have a little bit of sticking to the hoja here, but you can see that the tamal is kind of standing up on its own. You know, it might still need to cook a little bit at the center, but you can see this like nice fluffy texture that we have here. Grab another spoon. These spoons are here. And I'm just going to take a little bit off the top here. You can see nice, fluffy, delicious texture. Let me taste to see if it's, and this is another way to test too, is like, just literally take one out, take a bite out of it, or cut it down the center and see how the center is looking. And if it's still not ready, you can put it back, like you can still roll it back up and put it back into the pot. And then take that same one out later and see if it's cooked all the way through. But typically at least an hour's time will yield a cooked tamal. Yeah, still a little bit chewy. Still needs a little bit more time. But so delicious. The corn flavor is definitely stand out. No doubt about it, it's a corn tamal. And the sweeter the corn kernels that you have, the even better it will be. And it just has like a really nice kind of like fluffy, kind of cakey texture to it. Super, super yummy. This could use just a little, it's like almost there. Again, this is probably like about 85 to 95%, 85 to 90% way there of doneness. It just needs like a little bit more time to cook. It could also be because I literally just took it out of the pot and I'm trying to taste it as if like it's ready to go. Like I mentioned, I like to give it some time to rest and I didn't give it that time. But if I look at it here, I don't know if you can see that. It's like nice and cakey and fluffy. All right, any other questions? Folks cooking, not cooking. I love to answer any questions you may have before we wrap up.
Was your heat for the tamales on low the whole time?
It was on about a medium heat.
Oh, okay.
I was being a little aggressive with it too, because I was like, I want these to try to be done by the end of class. But yeah, usually about a medium heat will be great for the 45 to an hour.
I have a question. Can I make the tamales the day before and then keep them in the fridge and then cook them the next day? What are your suggestions?
Yeah, that is a great question. I typically would prefer to make them and then cook them on the same day and then reheat them for the second day. So
what's the best way to reheat them? Kind of the same way you cook them?
Exactly, you would steam them again. Yeah. Yeah, so rather than keeping the raw masa in the hojas, I think I've never done that, to be honest with you. I would just be afraid that they would get dried out unless you use a good amount of like plastic wrap or something. Like if you put them in a pot, standing up in your fridge, covered in like plastic, I think that could work. But I've personally never done that. I always cook them right away. Okay. And then you can freeze them, you can reheat them, you can refrigerate them, and use them again whenever you need them.
Great, thank you.